Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-part series, which is brought to you with support from the Global Environmental Justice Documentary Film Collection, my guests and I will be discussing the benefits and techniques behind using documentary films as instruction and research tools. Joining me are Becky Overmyer-Velázquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. We'll be using the Global Environmental Justice Documentaries collection as a jumping-off point and centerpiece for our discussions, and earning a highly recommended rating in Choice Reviews. The GEJ Film Collection currently contains 48 documentary films and teacher's guides focus on environmental justice themes relating, for now, to Asia and North America. The collection got its start in 2019 at Whittier College when Gary, Jake, and Becky began collaborating on the initial curation of film titles and the design of the teacher's guides. Further curation and teacher guide authorship were provided by a growing list of faculty from Whittier and other institutions, and funding from the Henry Luce Foundation supported the growth and distribution of the platform. The collection is aimed at the undergraduate level, but the films are also suitable for secondary and postgraduate use. Importantly for this series, however, is the invaluable insight we get from Jake and Becky into the ways in which teaching faculty use documentary films and GEJ's custom teacher's guides as highly effective pedagogical tools. We'll learn about how faculty help curate the collection, write the guides, and how documentaries are most effectively incorporated into instruction. In this first episode of our 4-part series, we're introduced to Becky, Jake, and Gary and how GEJ got its start. Okay, Becky, Gary, and Jake, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right. So why don't we start with a round of introductions? Can each of you just describe where you work and what you do? And Becky, why don't we start with you?
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. I work at Whittier College. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I also coordinate the new Environmental Justice Studies program here at the college. And for the last 2 years now, I've been living on campus as the faculty in residence at Hartley House, doing some social justice, environmental justice programming.
Excellent. And Jake, how about you?
Great. Thank you very much. Jake Carbine. I am a professor in the Department of Religious Studies. I also currently serve as our Director of International Programs. So I'm balancing that role in relation to teaching a number of courses about Asian religions and religion and society more broadly.
Okay, perfect. And then Gary.
Hi, thanks very much for doing this. I'm really looking forward to this whole podcast. My name is Gary Marcuse. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. A lot of the work that I've done over the last 20 years has centered on environmental issues. And the most recent project that I did, which will bring me closer to Whittier College, and this project was called Waking the Green Tiger. It was a story of the rise of an environmental movement, a green movement in China, a place where you hardly expect to see green activism. But the story, we had a kind of an interesting story to tell there. And eventually that put me on a circuit around to many of the universities interested in that film. And I really enjoy kind of taking the films that I make into the classroom. So I was really delighted when I heard from Jake that he and Whittier College would be very interested in having me in, not just for the usual single screening, but for a whole range of activities with different classes under different subject areas. So that would give me a chance both to gauge kind of the response to the film in many different subjects, and also to start working with a new group of teachers, which I really enjoy.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I think in our discussions, we'll certainly talk a lot about how films enhance instructional situations. And but before we get there, Becky and Jake, I'm wondering if you could each sort of just describe your role with GEJ and what that has entailed for you.
So I had two broad roles in the constitution of the GEJ project. One was several years ago, I was directing a loose initiative on Asian Studies and Environment grant on campus, and we were put in contact with Gary and a filmmaker in China relative to the Waking the Green Tiger project. In the context of that discussion, we had another series of discussions about what we might do with documentaries as pedagogical tools, and that led to a series of conversations. And then Gary was sort of lead person, but I worked very closely with Gary on the second grant application to the Luce Foundation that really kickstarted the GEJ project. So there's that kind of larger level of engagement. The second way in which I've been involved is I wrote a number of guides, 4 or 5 depending on how you count them. The 5x5 Voices of Change from the Forests of Indonesia, and Hope in a Changing Climate, Before the Flood 1 and 2, Dams, Drugs, and Democracy, and A River Changes Course. So I was really heavily involved as an author on the study guides, and in that context, worked very closely with both Becky and Gary, and in some cases had separate conversations with filmmakers.
Okay. And Becky, back to you.
Yeah, I guess, comparatively, my role was much simpler. I feel like Jake asked if I wouldn't mind helping recruit and coordinate the writing of the guides by faculty members on campus. So, interdisciplinary group of faculty. So, so I reached out to folks. We started developing really together the format that we ended up having using in the guides, and this was in collaboration with Gary. So this was a back and forth collaboration between the writers and Gary and Jake and I, thinking about what would a good guide look like that would be really helpful to instructors at Whittier and beyond. So I did that. We developed that. We, developed the final list. The final list of films that we were actually going to view and write about, and then assigned films to different authors, different faculty on campus. And then I was really their editor, helping them to finally give the final, put in the final edits, think about formatting again, and collaborate with Gary to make sure that it was all ready for production on a website. And that was really my role for about a year, I guess it was, that we did that.
Okay, excellent. So Gary, I wanted to touch base with you and see, and add a little bit to Jake's description of how sort of GEJ kind of got off the ground, and sort of initially built up its collection. And and there was some involvement from the Luce Foundation, and so I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that and give us sort of the origin story of GEJ.
Yes, very much. This whole project is born out of a kind of a great pleasure of finding collaborations between filmmakers and educators. In this case, we were aiming at kind of third-year students at Whittier College as kind of the basis for designing a teacher's guide. I had done several of these kind of collections in the past, so we did have a bit of a model to work with. In Canada, I worked with the National Film Board of Canada, collecting together 24 different documentaries selected on Indigenous issues, and the documentaries themselves were selected by Indigenous educators, and we had a sort of a collaboration with First Nations and non-Native teachers involved in it, just to make sure that it was really accessible. And that project took us a year or so to put together. We wound up with 24 different films in the collection and a 100-page teacher's guide. What was interesting was that there was a great need for this when this opportunity came up. There have been a lot of issues going on, particularly in Canada, with Indigenous stories, Indigenous land claims, and kind of searching for a better understanding, I guess, and collaboration with First Nations communities and educators. The collection that we came up with, called First Nations: The Circle Unbroken, wound up being placed in every high school in Canada and became a kind of standard teaching device for about 15 or 20 years. So it just showed us that working with a model that really focused on the educators and the communities would be a great way to assemble the material, and it has a kind of an authenticity. So curation became a very important issue for us throughout. We figured these things needed to be carefully curated, needed to have really good input, and needed to be able to reach a wide range of students in different kinds of settings, not just for Indigenous studies, but they could also be used in other subject areas. We did an additional project called on media education that also involved teachers and generated 2 50-page teacher's guides and a whole collection of material for use in the classroom, maybe 100 video examples. And that also became a standard teaching device tool in Canada for about 15 years and also sold very well in the United States. So we had some good experience knowing that if we'd used a good process, we could come up with a good result. And for me, it's just a great pleasure to see the kind of what I think of as the lightning in the bottle when teachers are able to find that moment, that teaching moment with the students. Particularly in the cases, the kind of subjects we're talking about, including environmental justice, these are key issues of our time. So that students and faculty, I think, come to this with a kind of a fresh desire to explore these things in their classrooms and to see if they can apply those, what became eventually 48 different films in a lot of different subject areas. So that's the kind of the background for the kind of the design and the impulse to make the collection. And then we went on to find out what I did essentially then was to collect together maybe 150 different examples of films about environmental justice that could be used in many different ways. And then I offered them to the group of faculty that Whittier College was organizing and said, which one of these would you really like to utilize and teach in a classroom and also write a teacher's guide for? So we try and maintain that sense of curation and participation and responsibility for the content, not through me, but through all the faculty that we were working with. And so that process worked out really well. I think we started off with about 60 teachers and maybe 15 different films from the Whittier College writing group. And then over time, this has been going on now for about 3.5 years. We added another film or two each year based on things that the teachers were saying they wanted to hear or suggestions that people have passed along to us. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk about a few of the examples of those films, but that's the kind of the genesis of the project as a whole.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Gary. And speaking of having, recruiting faculty members, Becky and Jake, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that process. What was the approach to your fellow faculty in sort of inviting them into this process?
Well, Jake, you had already worked with some faculty on the Luce grant or previous grant, right? And so I know some of the folks came out of that original project.
Yes, I think all but one of the faculty team members were participants in the Luce Foundation grant.
Yeah. So there was already, these were folks already focusing on global environmental issues and are teaching in some capacity that in their courses. Either these were historians, but also biologists, geologists, and social scientists, other folks in the humanities who at Whittier, we started realizing better that we were all focusing not just on global, but also on environment. And they were the easy targets to ask to do this work. And I think almost all of them, maybe except one, ended up deciding to do it and wrote at least a couple of these guides.
Nice. Excellent.
I think the only thing I might add to that is one of the other elements of discussion that we had is we put Gary in contact with our librarians and to sort of get their input on what, from a librarian perspective, might be a nice kind of interface. And that eventually we have the GEJ linked within our library resources now. And, those early conversations were also an important part of this, the team, so to speak, that was working on the project.
Yeah, that was really important to us. We really wanted to have that kind of curatorial input. And I did spend about 2 hours sitting with the librarians, because one of the keys to making those other projects work that I mentioned on media literacy and indigenous studies was finding a price point that was so attractive that even schools with very limited budgets could seriously consider acquiring it, because it was designed to be a bargain. And we could do that because the underwriting for the cost of writing the teacher's guide, it cost us maybe $1,500 for each new film that we put into the collection. So we needed an underwriter to really help us bridge that gap. Otherwise, we'd have to charge so much for it, the collection, that it would then become economically unfeasible, or just very difficult for librarians to consider. So when I sat with the Whittier librarians, I said, suppose you had a collection here of maybe, at that point, I think we were thinking 25 different documentaries. What would you expect to pay for the rights for that? And they looked at me and said, $1,500, maybe $2,000 for that many titles. And I said, well, clearly, and would you then purchase it? And they said, absolutely not. We don't have that kind of funding. That's very rare to have it. Overall, a lot of documentaries get lost behind the paywalls that are put up to charge libraries for individual use of films. It can easily cost $250 to $400 for an individual title to use by one university for a year. So I said, well, suppose the cost of the collection was lower. I kept dropping it further and further down, $1,000, $800. When I said $400, their eyes lit up. And I said, okay, well, let's see if we can do a project based on what you can afford, not just how much the market costs. And I can try and round up the filmmakers who are willing to participate in that. I could work with distributors who would see this as another outlet. And basically, I could serve as a kind of a bridge between the filmmakers, the teachers, and the librarians. And all that depended on having a nice price point. So we settled on a price point of $400 per year, $400 per year if you're doing a 3-year license, $495 if you just want to try it for 1 year. And that proved to be pretty interesting. I think that kind of captured people's attention. And the Luce Foundation then, it's very hard to find foundations that will support distribution of films. A lot of them will support the making of new ones, but how do you circulate them? And that kind of remains a key part of the puzzle. But we settled on that price, and the Luce Foundation even pre-purchased 30 different licenses and gave them away to all the colleges that were working in this Luce initiative on Southeast Asia environmental issues. So we found a kind of a comfortable fit for everybody there. And then it was a matter of spending the time and the effort to write those guides and to make them sure that they're useful and test them out and so on. So that the Luce Foundation played a key role in this as one of the kind of the instigators and funders. And it was their bridging financing that allowed us to basically not have to charge back all those heavy expenses to the libraries themselves.
You just heard from Becky Overmyer-Velázquez, Associate Professor of Sociology at Whittier College, Jake Carbine, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, also at Whittier, and Gary Marcuse, Project Director at Face to Face Media, the producer of the GEJ documentaries. This episode is brought to you with support from GEJ. Join us next week as we explore how the films are selected for inclusion into the GEJ collection, how the teacher's guides are written and used during instruction, and the ability of the films and guides to be used in a highly cross-disciplinary nature. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.